When Che Guevara was captured in Bolivia, the situation was not chaotic. Contrary to later portrayals, the hours that followed were marked by order, communication, and control. Information moved quickly. Decisions were made quietly. What did not happen is just as important as what did. Che was wounded, exhausted, and isolated, but he was alive. His capture was known to multiple actors within a short period of time. Local military units were informed. Political authorities were briefed. International intelligence channels became aware of the situation. This was not a moment lost in confusion. It was a moment contained. In similar situations, urgency often creates negotiation. Prisoners become leverage. Time opens space for intervention. None of that occurred here. No serious attempt was made to delay events. No negotiation channels were opened. No external pressure was applied with the intention of changing the outcome. The absence of action was not explained publicly. It was simply absorbed. Within the Bolivian command structure, Che's capture was treated as a problem already resolved. The question was not what should be done, but how quickly it should be concluded. This framing removed the possibility of alternative outcomes. Once the situation was defined this way, inaction became procedure. What is often overlooked is that multiple opportunities for intervention existed. Communication infrastructure was active. Requests could have been transmitted. Decisions could have been escalated. None of these steps were pursued with urgency. Silence in this context was not the result of ignorance. It was the result of alignment. At the international level, the situation was equally contained. Those who were aware of Che's capture understood the implications. Intervention would have required political risk, diplomatic pressure, or public exposure. Each of these options threatened stability. Stability at that moment was prioritized over intervention. This prioritization did not require a formal agreement. It required shared understanding. Each actor involved understood what action would cost and what inaction would preserve. The calculation did not need to be articulated. It was implicit. The decision not to act was never announced because it did not need to be justified. It fit within an existing logic. Che Guevara had already been removed from the center of power. His isolation in Bolivia was not accidental. His capture did not disrupt an active strategy. Completed one. From this perspective, rescue was never seriously considered because rescue would have reversed a process already accepted. Saving Che would have reintroduced uncertainty. It would have required reintegration, explanation, and renegotiation of roles that had already been settled through distance. This is why silence prevailed. In the hours following Che's capture, the most significant action was restraint. By choosing not to intervene, those with the capacity to do so allowed events to proceed toward their expected conclusion. Responsibility was not claimed by any single individual because it did not belong to one. It was distributed across institutions, priorities, and unspoken agreements. This distributed responsibility is what made the outcome possible. No single decision can be isolated and condemned. Instead, a series of non-decisions created momentum. Each moment of waiting narrowed the range of possible outcomes until only one remained. Che Guevara did not die because no one knew he was alive. He died because no one moved to keep him that way. In the next part, we will examine who had the ability to intervene, why those channels remained silent, and how inaction became the safest choice for everyone involved. By the time Che Guevara was held in custody, the question was not whether intervention was possible, but who was positioned to initiate it. Several actors had the capacity to influence events. What is striking is not their absence, but their restraint. At the local level, Bolivian military authorities controlled Che's immediate fate. They had custody, communication access, and time. Contrary to later claims of urgency, there was a window in which alternative actions could have been explored. Delays could have been justified. Transfers could have been requested. None of these options were pursued seriously. The command structure treated the situation as closed rather than developing. Beyond Bolivia, international intelligence agencies were aware of Che's capture within a short time frame. This awareness did not translate into pressure. Intelligence channels are designed not only to observe but to signal. In this case, signaling was minimal. No effort was made to transform information into leverage. Observation remained observation. Cuba itself occupied a uniquely ambiguous position. Officially, Che had departed voluntarily and operated independently. This framing limited the obligation to respond. Intervening would have contradicted the narrative that Che was acting on his own initiative. Silence preserved consistency. Action would have required acknowledgement. This ambiguity functioned as protection. By maintaining distance, Cuban leadership avoided being drawn into a situation that demanded explanation. Any attempt to intervene would have raised questions about authority, responsibility, and intent. Silence avoided all three. International political actors faced similar calculations. Che Guevara's survival would not have stabilized the region. It would have complicated it. Pressuring Bolivia to delay or negotiate would have introduced diplomatic friction with uncertain benefit. From a state perspective, inaction was safer than engagement. What emerges from these layers is not a single point of failure, but a convergence of incentives. Each actor assessed the situation independently and arrived at the same conclusion. Intervention carried higher risk than restraint. When multiple actors reach this conclusion simultaneously, inaction becomes reinforced. This convergence explains why no urgent coalition formed. No emergency meetings were called. No public statements demanded access. The mechanisms that could have slowed events were available, but unused. Their non-use was not coordinated explicitly. It was aligned implicitly. It is important to note that this alignment did not require hostility toward Che. Respect and admiration existed. What was absent was willingness to reintroduce instability. Che's presence, alive and active, represented uncertainty. His capture created a moment of decision. His survival would have reopened questions that distance had already resolved. In this context, silence functioned as policy. Not written, not announced, but practiced. Each hour that passed without action narrowed the field of possible outcomes. Waiting became a form of decision-making. This is why responsibility remains difficult to assign. No single order prevented intervention. No explicit refusal was issued. Instead, a sequence of pauses replaced initiative. Each pause appeared reasonable in isolation. Together, they produced finality. Understanding who could have intervened clarifies why no one did. The structures that might have acted were optimized for stability, not rescue. When faced with a choice between preserving order and preserving an individual, order prevailed. In the next part, we will examine how this silence was later explained, how the narrative of inevitability was constructed, and why the absence of intervention was reframed as lack of possibility rather than lack of will. After the opportunity for intervention passed, the remaining task was not explanation but consolidation. Events were allowed to conclude, and once they did, the narrative began to form almost immediately. What mattered now was not what could have happened, but how what did happen would be understood. The first step in this process was framing. Che's death was presented as the unavoidable result of local circumstances, geography, isolation, and enemy action. This framing was effective because it redirected attention away from decision-making and toward environment. If conditions were impossible, then choices became irrelevant. Within Bolivia, official statements emphasized necessity and urgency. The execution was described as a security measure, not a political act. This language minimized agency. It suggested that events unfolded faster than they actually did, leaving no time for alternatives. Speed became the justification for silence. Internationally, the explanation was absorbed rather than challenged. Governments and institutions repeated the same logic. Che Guevara was operating independently. He was engaged in a failed insurgency. His capture and death were consequences of that failure. This repetition transformed interpretation into consensus. What is rarely acknowledged is how quickly this consensus solidified. There was no prolonged debate, no sustained inquiry. The absence of questioning did not reflect lack of interest. It reflected alignment. Challenging the narrative would have required acknowledging that other outcomes were possible, and that those outcomes were consciously avoided. Over time, the language surrounding Che's death became ritualized. Words like inevitable, unavoidable, and tragic replaced terms associated with choice. Tragedy implies loss without responsibility. Inevitability implies absence of agency. Together, they erased the space where intervention once existed. This erasure was reinforced by time. As years passed, the moment of capture faded into history. What remained were simplified summaries. New generations encountered the story as settled fact, not as a sequence of decisions. Silence, repeated long enough, became truth. Those who had been closest to the moment understood this transformation. They recognized that speaking later would not restore complexity. It would challenge a version of events that had already become foundational. Silence, once protective, became habitual. The most effective aspect of this silence was that it required no enforcement. No documents were sealed publicly. No testimonies were formally suppressed. The structure of incentives was enough. Speaking offered no benefit and carried potential cost. Not speaking preserved stability and avoided disruption. This dynamic explains why the question of rescue rarely surfaced in serious discourse. Asking why no one intervened would have required acknowledging that intervention was possible. Possibility implies choice. Choice implies responsibility. Responsibility was precisely what the emerging narrative sought to avoid. In this way, silence did not simply follow the decision not to act, completed it. By eliminating the language of alternatives, silence ensured that inaction would never appear as a decision at all. Che Guevara's death was thus enclosed within a story that left no room for reconsideration. The outcome was treated as an endpoint rather than a junction. The absence of rescue was reframed as absence of opportunity. In the final part, we will examine how this narrative endured for decades, why it was rarely challenged, and what changes when silence itself becomes the subject of examination. For decades, the story of Che Guevara ended where it was most convenient, with his death. The absence of intervention was absorbed into the narrative as circumstance rather than choice. This framing did more than explain events. Protected structures. Silence achieved what action could not. It prevented reopening questions that had no safe answers. It allowed institutions to move forward without reassessing earlier decisions. It transformed a moment of possibility into a moment of closure. By not acting, those with the ability to intervene avoided immediate instability. By not speaking afterward, they avoided long-term accountability. Silence bridged the gap between decision and outcome. It ensured continuity. Over time, this silence reshaped memory. Che's final days became symbolic rather than procedural. His death was interpreted as the inevitable fate of a revolutionary rather than the endpoint of a series of non-decisions. The question of rescue disappeared because it threatened to expose choice where inevitability had been carefully constructed. What makes this silence significant is not that it was enforced, but that it was shared. Each actor involved understood what speaking would imply. Silence required no coordination. It required only alignment of interest. Stability, once prioritized, became self-sustaining. As years passed, the silence no longer needed justification. It became tradition. Histories were written around it. Documentaries repeated it. The absence of intervention faded from inquiry and became background. Only much later did this absence begin to stand out. Not because new evidence emerged, but because distance weakened the need for cohesion. When the urgency of preservation faded, the silence itself became visible. Re-examining Che's death through this lens does not rewrite history, clarifies it. It shows how outcomes are shaped not only by actions taken, but by actions withheld. It reveals how systems resolve uncertainty not through confrontation, but through delay and omission. Che Guevara was not abandoned in a moment of confusion. He was left within a framework that had already accepted separation. His death did not disrupt strategy, concluded it. Understanding this does not diminish Che's legacy. It places it within the realities of power, where ideals and structures rarely coexist without friction. It also reminds us that silence, when repeated and normalized, becomes one of the most effective tools of decision-making. History often records what was done. Less often does it record what was deliberately not done. This story is about that difference.